Hello, Sarah.
There she is. Hey.
Hi. How are you?
I'm like, it's Konbanwa for me and Ohio for you. Right.
Ohayou gozaimasu.
Mhm.
Yes.
There we go. So, hello everyone again. This
Hi.
is I'm Sarah Dzida,
And I'm Natalie Hamilton.
and we are the authors who did a reading a week ago, 2 weeks ago, for called A Very Japanese Reading in English about our new books. Ready, Natalie? New book presentation.
Yes. Yes. And this book, The
Okay.
Kanji Code.
That's right. And we had such a good time at our reading and so many great questions that we had to do extra QAs in order to get them done.
Yay.
Mm-hmm. And so we did one earlier on Japanese, Japan, and the JET program, which you can view on YouTube. We'll post that later, or you can go on YouTube and look at it now. And this is the second and final Q&A. It's about poetry, process, and publishing. Since we're doing this on Instagram Live, I guess we should just do a little rundown as to what our books are actually about, right, Natalie? Do you want to go first?
Yeah. Okay, sure. So the Kanji Code is it's a reference book basically. It gives you an introduction to the sounds of kanji, which is I like the readings of particularly the on readings, but I also talk about kun readings, and I give lists of basically it's quite visual. I give some visual guides to how to remember the on readings of kanji as a way to help you get better at reading Japanese and to sort of take away the overwhelm of kanji reading, because a lot of people get totally overwhelmed when they see these long lists of kanji. And I'm trying to help it be a bit more systematic so you can actually learn these things rather than having to just rote learn them.
Yeah, totally. And she does, because I remember being frustrated with kanji learning. And FYI, for people who don't know, like, we met each other in Japan, which is why we are talking together on the JET program and why we are here. My book is a hybrid poetry memoir about my time in Japan and based off of correspondence that I wrote with a friend about just about friendship and living abroad and growing up. And there's poetry and emails and stories about my time in Japan there. And Natalie thinks it's great, so you should check it out.
I do. Mm-hmm. It's fabulous. Please read.
So as we said, this final Q&A is about poetry, process, and publishing. We've got a handful of questions here to get through. And the first question is, what was the inspiration for your works? Natalie, do you want to start?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess the inspiration for me was just my own learning process, where when I was trying to learn, Japanese is very complex, compared to some languages. It's not just vocabulary and grammar. It's also got this added side because it's a different written script. And the written script even is more complicated than most languages because there's hiragana, there's katakana, and there's kanji. And the kanji have multiple readings. So it's very, very complex. And it's great. I was living there, so I had wanted to learn it, but I found it challenging even with my own overzealous studying. So I was just trying to find something systematic, and so it's basically inspired by my own struggles at the time, and also I suppose because I've been a teacher, because I've written technical writing a lot, like user guides. I just wanted to make something really plain English that people could actually pick up and read and understand, and even if they're 12 years old or 50 years old. Because I think the other thing that I found, like, the higher your level gets, the less English there is in all the textbooks. And I understand why in one sense, like, yes, you should, if you can read Japanese, you should be able to read Japanese. But I think there's a bit of a, that can be a barrier for some people, because just because your level is increasing doesn't mean that you don't need explanations in your first language so you can really deeply understand them.
Yeah, that's true, actually. I'm thinking about, while you're saying this, is I've been to like lots of when I go to like writing conferences, I love to go to translator workshops, honestly, because I feel like translators are the biggest, most passionate nerds. Like they became translators just because they love the language so much. And so many translators are just translating work because they were like, well, no one else was going to do it, so I had to do it. And so kind of the same thing here, right? Like you were like, well, nobody else is doing it, so I'm going to do it because this was my journey,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah, pretty much. And yeah, just not being able to find a list of phonetic components and then gradually finding them here and there, but just on little random web pages and wanting to have something that's actually people can find and refer to, and hoping that some English, some Japanese teachers rather can use it as well, just to kind of make the process a bit more accessible.
Right,
That's
totally.
the goal. Yes, but yeah, translators are nerds. That is true. I can confirm that. Yes.
Cool.
Yeah. What about you? What
Like,
inspired you?
yeah. So I've always just really loved poetry and writing, and I think like what I've always enjoyed about the process is just trying to find new ways to express and articulate things. And so the particular inspiration behind Dearest Enemy, my book, is, as I said, I was living in Japan in the JET program, and I just felt really far away from my ability to express myself. I think I said this at the reading. Like it was just my strongest skill was my ability to write and to speak and to communicate. And then suddenly you're a gaijin, you don't know how to do anything. You can barely read. You don't even know how to read a menu. I remember like I used to drink milk before I went to Japan, and then I stopped because I couldn't read the milk cartons, and I couldn't figure out what milk was in the grocery store. And then my last year there, I was in the grocery store and I was like, oh, it's clear as day. It says like low fat and non-fat and 1% milk, but I couldn't read it. So I was, of course,
take it for granted.
Right? Like you just take things for granted. And so I felt very far away from myself, and I did a lot of just I started doing drills and writing poetry while I was in Japan, because also the fact that you don't communicate, you find that you can't express yourself to your colleagues or your neighbors or your friends. And so you feel very separate from everything. And I had this friend, Katrina, who's in the book. She's the Dearest Enemy, where she was kind of the same position, but in the States, and we were writing to each other as enemies. And I think it was kind of like this exercise that we did for ourselves to make us feel better. Like, oh, we are still these badass writers if we so choose to be. And I'm glad that you recognize it. And so in the course over my time in Japan, she asked me to write a wedding poem for her. And so that was probably the longest it ever took me to write something. It took me about a year to write the wedding poems. And I just always really loved the kind of things that we put together. And so it took 10 years for the book to be put together, because I just had all these little pieces. And I think like that's very true of a lot of my writing, is I just kind of go through life and I'm thinking about things and kind of writing things down in journals, and I'm talking to people, and these kind of ideas stick, and then just they kind of form together, and I just want to kind of share it because I think it's very interesting, and it's obviously something that I obsess over for like a decade. So if I obsess over it for 10 years, then probably someone else will find it interesting too. And also I think like it was just, the stories that probably for you, Natalie, like you have the stories that you say over and over again based on your time in Japan that just like illustrate what's going on. And even though I feel like people have heard me say these stories, when they read the book, they're like, oh, I didn't know that happened to you. So it's like a journal in a way also for people to be like, oh, this was the experience for you as well.
Yeah. It's great. There were things in there that I didn't know happened that it was really interesting to read about.
Yeah, very, very,
and strange
dimensional lives.
Yeah, because I was there. But yeah, that's the interesting thing, isn't it? That the same event can be seen differently by everybody who's there. So that's for me fascinating too.
And actually, I think that's really kind of one of the things that came out of the book when I put it together, is like, how do you have these two people and they're writing this correspondence looking at events, but do they see the same thing? And then you have a foreigner and a Japanese person. Do they see the same thing? And students and teachers, and like, really, if you can get everybody in a room together and they're all on the same page, like it's an amazing accomplishment.
That's true.
Right?
That's true. Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that's a lot of inspiration for my work, honestly, whatever that is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So our next question here is, I know it's hard for artists to talk about their process, which we just did, high five to us. And since sometimes they don't know, but I'd love to hear how you come up with a poem, especially poems that are related and anything you want to share with young poets. So I know you do creative writing also outside. So if you have anything that you want to add,
Yeah.
feel free to share. But at
Yeah.
least for me, there are poems in the book, and I'd say like a lot of the poems were not written for the book. They were just written at some point over the last, 10, 15 years. And when I started piecing the book together, I just kind of was like, I had a sense of a timeline. And so I went back and I looked at the poems. And some poems, they exist in a location that they didn't naturally exist in. There's a poem in there called Compliment, which honestly was actually inspired by a compliment from a boy in Japan, who I just felt so beautiful over after the compliment. It took me I think that's something very much of my process is you want to capture this moment in like a bottle, this feeling or this visual and how it makes you feel. And so a lot of the poems are kind of based off of this feeling. And I remember for that poem, Compliment, I spent like 3 or 4 days being like, I have this feeling, I don't know how to express it. And suddenly then the poem was just like out. And it was like, this is the poem and this is how it felt. And, but in the book itself, I actually ended up using it in a different way to express a different feeling after a different anecdote. So, but the feeling transferred very nicely over, actually.
Yeah.
So, so that's how a lot of the poems are. And I think my poetry as well is very based off of who I'm having the conversation with. There are lines in there, especially to my foe. So as an example, we're just having a conversation of where's the thing that I'm thinking of? We're just I was I thought it all began because of a word, nemesis. You stole it from my unknowing throat, tied the polite reciprocation of being titled to my shoulders. It's I would say that to nobody else but to her. And that's kind of, I think, a beautiful thing of just, you need this environment and this person to have this creation. And I'm always very interested in that. And that's also the fun thing about doing this with you, is that I would not have these Q&As and I would not have this experience unless it was with you.
Kochira koso. Yeah, it is nice.
Right?
It's nice to have someone to bounce off and who's equally interested.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Fascinating process. I'm trying to think of my process, and I guess the one thing that just popped into my head was that I've done my book a bit like you in stages. I did the list of phonetic components 15 years ago when I was in Japan and started using it, and it helped me with my own Japanese. But then when I came back to Sydney, I did a Master of Translation, and at the end of that I just did a linguistics dissertation sort of for fun as an elective. And so I sort of revisited what I'd done and tried to make it a bit more formal, and read all this research about phonetics and phonology, and kind of went a lot of random topics, which was just interesting. So then I wrote that up for the dissertation, which then sort of an edited version of that got into the book. And then I was working on the list, and then I was like, oh, I need example words. So then I sort of sat down and wrote not just the list of phonetics, but example kanjis for it that contain them, and then example words that contain them, and then I had to translate all the words, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger. It took me...
I want to say, I think that's the key to both of the processes, right? Even the inspiration, you don't know what you're making when you just you're just interested in it, and you're just let me just scratch a little here, and then what you're just saying, it just gets bigger and bigger, and suddenly you're I have all these things, I need to make all these things do something, so somebody who's not me can understand what's going on, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was so then when I hired a graphic designer, because I knew that I wanted it to look look professional, and I'm not a designer, and there's no way I could kind of get things to be lined up neatly in the middle of the page and so on.
Well, I remember at proposals with you, I think you sent me a couple of graphic designs.
Yes, thank you. It was great to get your input. Yeah, it's And yeah, I got a designer. She's really good. She's a real professional, years and years. She's been doing like, she does major art exhibitions and all the booklets and pamphlets for those. So I was very fortunate to get her. But when in our first meeting, I was trying to explain, what are these? And she was like, well, what is, what is a kanji and what is a phonetic? And I sort of realized, oh, I think I need to explain this a bit better. So I actually went back and like wrote a whole other section after me having talked to her because I realized it was a lot of information without a lot of
Mm-hmm.
explanation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so again, and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And it was like, I'd already been working 9 months pretty solidly on it. And then I met her, and then it kind of went another several months of intense back and forth. Yeah.
It's funny that you say that because I basically ended up finally writing this book as my thesis in grad school. And for the first 7 months of the thesis with my advisor, she was like, what is this? Like, is it a love story? Is it a memoir? Is it this? And I was like, no, 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 no. And so you're just like that's like the second, like you
Hybrid.
have all the pieces, right? You figure it out, and then you have to figure out how to put the pieces together. And then you have to talk to a person and be like, do you understand? Like, is this coming through? What's happening?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was really gratifying when I finally finished it, because it was just kind of like this validation of, I had this idea in my head that I couldn't express for so many years. I knew there was a possibility, and now here it is in my hands that I can share with people.
Yay.
Right? Mm-hmm.
Congratulations.
Yeah, same to you.
To have that. Thank you. Yeah.
Same for us.
It's a yeah for us.
So the next question is, when you were writing your books, what was your first priority in depicting life in Japan and Japanese culture?
Well, maybe why don't you take that one first, because that's probably a bit more relevant for you, but I can comment on it a bit.
So I think, like, for me, it was less about, I don't know if I'm sure I was thinking about it. I know, like, I was choosing pieces because I was trying to tell a story about this friendship. So that was the most important thing. And I was weaving through several timelines because the story actually encompasses several, like a span of years. And so I remember there was a really important moment when I was writing the book and figuring out how the pieces were put together, was kind of realizing there were 5 sections and 5 moments of the story. And like in between these sections, this is the span of time that has passed. And so the beginning of this section, like for instance, as I said, it's a wedding. It leads up to the writing of these wedding poems, actually. And so like the first section is like, well, obviously I have to arrive in, like you have to meet us. Like you have to realize we're friends and I need to arrive in Japan. And so it was like, okay, if that's the case, then this is the writing pieces that I have found. And my friend actually was really lovely. We spent a couple months where we were going through all of our writing and journals and like pulling out pieces and being like, okay, this is what we have. So I was looking at kind of like the jigsaw puzzles, being like, okay, if this is the span of time, this is the writing that I have that exists. And what feelings do I need to communicate? And what feelings and communication and anecdotes are like tied into her or to the character as it is in this moment. So that was kind of a good process of elimination right there. And then I think naturally based on that, I started pulling out these pieces that like you see in the book, which is very much about the inspiration of like communication and identity. And I think it's also just the things that were interesting to me were less about Japan is weird and more about like, how do people communicate when you have all these barriers? And yet at the same time, how do you, in spite of the barriers, there's things you cannot know and you have to be okay with. And even in the barriers, you can still have moments of real connection. And so at the virtual reading, I read the police calligraphy, which was to me kind of a really good moment of this, which even before I put it in the book was always just something really special to me, of like, there was this teacher who took time out of her life to teach this strange foreign girl. I mean, we were there for like 8 hours and we just painted kanji together. And it was just this most really wonderful moment where she opened this door for me. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I see this like whole world of possibility and gateway. And we were doing it mostly in Japanese. So that was also really exciting for me. I remember I was so tired afterwards because I had to use so much Japanese. And when I left the house, I just felt heavy and my head ached so much. And at the same time, I felt like buzzed and light. It was just this really incandescent feeling, kind of, in a way. And I think like I had so many moments like that in Japan, and those just kind of kept popping up. And those were the ones that I ended up putting in the book. And even the ones that where you just have like real, you know, moments of frustration of like, there's just kind of no way. There's that moment where I talk about how there's this guy who arranges this Japanese group date with all of his elderly friends and invites us gaijin girls, and it's like they're obviously setting up for failure because they're making assumptions about us and they don't really care to know us, and like the communication just falls flat and they can't really understand why. And it's like because we're not really people to them in that moment. And then on the other side, like a story of our supervisor who was so lovely, and like I was over at a friend's house and we thought a mouse was in her cupboard and we called him and he came over to like save us. And it's like you had these two different spectrums of communication, right? And the way these experiences could go down, which you know because you had them as a jet yourself.
Yeah, definitely. No, it's the whole spectrum of experiences, and yeah, I can really relate to that feeling of exhaustion going to Enkais, especially because they would group together at the end of term. And if I had an Enkai, you know, you'd have like the whole school Enkai, you'd have the English department Enkai, then you'd have like the first year teachers Enkai. And, you know, I was going to them and I was trying so hard to kind of talk to people and listen. And yeah, I do remember having just like a headache at the end of that week and just going home like, oh, but good. But, you know, learning takes energy, and it does take it out of you.
Like you're just paying so much more attention because you also have to pay attention to like, what do you understand? What can you understand? Are you understanding? And so these moments were just like the calligraphy class where it's just like, we kind of went beyond that and we were talking about even, you know, the things of life that really make things worth living. And I was getting it. Were just super cool. And I really love those experiences.
Yeah.
So the next question is, unless you have anything else you want to add to that.
No, I mean, about Japanese, I mean, I suppose I was very aware of not being a Japanese person. I suppose that's the one thing, like for me, to have written a book about Japanese kanji, but not be Japanese, I was aware that was sort of a risk. And that's why for all my translations, I hired some translators, native Japanese translators, to proofread everything.
Yeah.
And
I had Yelly do my kanji. I got a jet to go and do mine. Hey, Yelly.
Oh yeah, Yelly. Yes, so that was definitely, I guess I just felt like if I don't do that, and I made sure I put that in, you know, the acknowledgements, then someone's going to say, what does she know? And I think that's something that I have, you know, struggled with and still do a little bit to this day. Like, what do I know about Japanese? What possessed me to think I could write this book? But as we said, I just had this thing, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger, and I did it, and I just wanted to sort of share it. But
yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and it does seem to have, you know, resonated with some people. So I guess it was worth it. But I guess, yeah, if you're out there and you're thinking of publishing something, you know, just kind of keep going with it, because someone will probably find something helpful in it.
Yeah, that's true. And that actually goes into our next question, which is, how did you get your books published? So I think like the interesting experience for both of us is that we're obviously both self-published, hooray. But we went through our own kind of winding paths to get there.
Yeah.
And I just to kind of tail end on the comment that you just made about like if you're publishing, like I used to be a book editor actually, and I always tell people who are writing their first books that it has to be something that you really enjoy and you really want to do. It's kind of I think, difficult to write to market, even though that's more lucrative, because if you don't care to do that, then you're never going to finish it. It has to be something like Natalie and I both toiled on these things for what, a decade each, just
Yeah.
because we couldn't help ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, um,
Yeah. You've got to have that's a good point.
right. And so there has to be, and so if you're, the reason why you're toiling on it is because there's something that I think, like for you, as you said, you saw that there was a gap consistently over and over again, and you kept getting that validation because you kept asking those questions and you saw other people kept asking those questions. And then for me, I don't know necessarily so much as it was a gap as just it was a story I was super interested in being able to share and tell. So
Yeah. And it is a fascinating story. I mean, you get a lot of these stories of, I mean, there's people still think of Japan, they think it's all, like Blade Runner,
they
Tokyo,
do,
big
yeah.
lights, city, or they think it's like an anime or something like that. So I think that, the inaka, the country life and the immersion of living there, not just visiting for a couple of weeks, but living for 2 years like you did.
Yeah, it's about like
Completely
kimono and
different.
yeah, that kind of stuff. I think about like one detail that I have in the book, which I was really glad I was able to put, was how much in Oita. So you remember in the city there was a lot of there were so many blind people or people who were sight impaired, and
Yeah.
so there were all like
Yes.
raised sidewalks and along the walls so that
Mm,
they could
mm.
touch along, and that's just something that you went, and that was actually true in a lot of the cities, but especially in Oita.
Yeah.
And I always thought that was super interesting.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, that was an interesting story that you tell about bumping into the blind man and then
Yeah.
helping
But
him.
in regards to like publishing, so at least for me,
Yeah.
like
What was your
I always, yeah, so like as I said, like this has been bubbling around since I left Japan probably more than a decade ago, but I didn't actually try and write it till I went to grad school, which was, gosh, maybe more than a decade ago now
and
too.
you was creative writing, right? Your grad
Yeah, and
school.
yeah, creative writing, and so I always knew that I was writing a hybrid poetry memoir. It was not Harry Potter and it was not Daniel Still. And so I tried for a couple of years after I finished it to get it published by a publishing house. And I just, I didn't have any luck. But also I have actually a really, as you know, I have a really extensive background in publishing and design. And so I kind of felt like because it was a very niche book anyway, that this was going to be a good publishing experiment to me to just self-publish myself. And then that way I could handle the quality of how it was laid out and edited and designed and everything. And again, Natalie is a totally impartial person, but she can tell you it's designed really well.
It is. Beautiful.
I hired a really great illustrator as well who helped me do it. And it was just a really great learning process. And so I went through the Amazon Kindle direct publishing platform, and that's where I published it. And it's been going great. I really like that it's print on demand and that there is an ebook version available. And it was a really good learning experience. There's a huge difference when you're helping somebody else get published and then you're doing your own book. Like I was way more emotionally involved than normal.
Yes.
Could get very fraught, the decision. So thank you to everyone who was super patient.
Yeah.
But I think like I one of the big things was is I learned that I had to not be, after the manuscript was written and I was really happy with that was done, is I had to learn to not be so precious with the final product, because it was more important to get it out to the masses than to like toil over all these details. And that again, like the most important thing is that you finish, and the point is to get people to read it and experience it than to just tell people about it. So
That's really cool. Sorry, I'm vaguing out a little bit now. I'm a little bit.
Like what was
I'm
your
just getting
publishing
over
process?
I just had a COVID test this morning, but I don't think I've got COVID, but I've had a little bit of a cold. But no, this is hearing you talking about I mean, I think that's interesting. Yeah, you did have the background and you were editing martial arts books, right? So you had that practical knowledge. And I had also worked as like a technical writer in sort
Hmm.
of like more like in IT and tech, doing software manuals and things like that. So
Yeah.
quite a different topic, but still, I felt confident in my ability to explain things and to try and do it in plain English. And I've been
Yeah.
working on informational guides for my whole career, really. So, and then I've been a teacher, and you've been a teacher, and that's all about
Yeah.
communication. So, I think it was a bit like you. It was kind of partly it was, oh, I've got this book. Oh, I hope people will buy it, but it was also, yeah, this will be an interesting learning experience for me, and I can still put it on my CV.
Hmm.
I published a book. So yeah, that's an interesting point. And yeah, for me, I kind of just mostly sat down in Word and just typed out this long, long list um, and in Excel. I did a lot of indexes.
Hmm.
I get a bit excited in Excel sometimes. So I've got all these really long indexes of sorting by different things by on reading, and then I did a sorting by radical,
Hmm.
which which is my innovation. Radicals, but they're not just in stroke order. They're in category. So I've got
Hmm.
body parts, or nature things together. But yeah, so I did it all in Word. But then I had to get it published, and so then I hired a professional graphic designer. I also hired a professional proofreader,
Oh, I did that
like an
too.
editor.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
did that too.
definitely.
Hmm.
And I guess I was very benefited the fact that my mother is an editor. She's retired now, but she was an editor and actually manager of publications department at a library, or like a large
Actually, that's a
institutional
good
library.
point too. Aside from the designer, it's just like I had like editors and people I trusted because of, just contacts in the industry and people I knew from like grad school.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
like you could, because if you try to do it all yourself, I think you're going to fail, right?
yeah,
Like things are definitely going to get messed up. You need to be able to trust and delegate to people.
definitely. And it was my mum who, in the end, referred me to my designer,
Mhm.
Virginia Buckingham, who did such an amazing job. And she was also, the one kind of nudging me along. Yes, make sure you get an editor, make sure you get a proofreader, just kind of giving me that, um, yeah, make sure you do it properly. And even my partner, he actually is a writer too, or he works in communications, and he did proofread as well. And you did too. So thank you.
That's right, I
So
did. Yeah,
looked, yeah, you did.
I did do that.
Yeah, you did. You checked an early draft because, yeah, I just wasn't. It was great to get your feedback because, yeah, you can think, oh, this makes sense, but actually, when you get other people's feedback, you realize, oh, that didn't, and oh,
Yeah.
there are gaps. I like to think I can write well, but there are gaps in the way I write.
No,
And there are
totally. Actually, you're right. Because
errors
actually,
I
after
make.
the first copy edit that I did, I went through and did a huge rewrite of actually a lot of anecdotes because I think
Mm,
my editor brain finally clicked in on my own writing, and I was just
mm,
like, oh, like this is really wordy, or this is really like long, or like why am I saying this,
mm.
or this doesn't make sense. So it was really important to get other people's handprints on it for sure.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So our last question.
Oh, I'll just say one more thing.
Oh yeah, yeah,
I
go for it.
went to Amazon for the ebook, so it's on Amazon for the ebook, which is great. And for the print, because I'm in Australia and Amazon was, I think, a bit more tricky over here, I use Ingram Spark,
Oh,
and
okay. I realized that.
they
Cool.
yeah, they're really good. I'm happy with them. They basically, you upload your files, you upload your cover art, and they distribute all over the world. And so my book can be found on all the local, Barnes and Noble in the US, or Waterstones in the UK, Book Depository, Booktopia in Australia. So all the major retailers, it just appeared on there, and
Oh
obviously people
yeah.
have to
See,
be able
I
to
don't have that.
look for
Yeah.
it. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really good because if I can basically just say to people, you can find it on your local thing, and then they Google around, they will find it, and then it prints. They've got printers everywhere, like all over the world. Even there's one printer in Melbourne here in Australia. So the printing is also very done locally and shipped locally.
That's
So
really
it's
cool.
quite amazing.
Yeah,
Mm.
that's really cool. I'm going to say for anyone who does want to self-publish, I think it's really important to have all your materials set up and ready to go before you try
Mm.
and put them into the systems.
Yeah.
Because what you do is like they walk you through, they're like, upload your cover, have your copy ready, your back cover, all this stuff. And if you try and like type it in without thinking about it, you're just going to go crazy. So you have to have like all of that prepared so that you can just upload it. Because even when you do, it took me like a good hour to figure it out and upload.
Yeah.
And then, you check and you make sure everything's fine. And then you might have to go back and realize like certain things are out of alignment or anything like that.
Yeah.
So it takes time, like, right? Like I definitely would say, even though it was self-published, it probably took about 2 years for me to self-publish, just because it was just me and then life and getting everything organized and getting it done. So yeah. How about you? How long did it take for you to like, once you decided to do it and get it done and you published?
Pretty much April 2018, I sort of got into it really intensively. And I was kind of doing at least 2 hours a day more or more. I was actually getting up I was very lucky. My 2-year-old son was like a late sleeper.
Oh,
so
yeah.
he would, if I let him, he would sleep till 9 a.m.
That's
So it was up late at night too, which was, but I would get up at 7 and I would just work for 2 hours every morning, which is my most productive time. And I was just kind of doing it every day, even like 7 days a week, kind of quite obsessively. And I just got right into it. So, and then probably by around November, December, I think is when I met the designer. So all up, and then it took us 2 or 3 months of quite intensive back and forth and fixing pagination and errors in, indexes and things. So 9 months, I like to think. So it was kind of like my second baby.
That's a good way of describing it. Definitely gestated, for sure.
That's how it felt.
Cool. So our last question is just how we went setting up this event and why, and kind of the logistics of that. It was very casual in that I sent Natalie an email and was like, yo, you're in Sydney and I'm in Los Angeles and everyone's online because of the pandemic. We should do a reading. That was pretty much it. And then as we mentioned at the beginning, Natalie and I are not just, we're not strangers. We're very good friends. We've known each other for 15 years now. Yeah.
16 since we first met.
Yeah, 16 years. So yeah. And so, and also like we were both very aware of the fact that we were writers and working on things over the last 15 or 16 years and very supportive of each other's efforts, obviously. And the nice thing is that because we were both JET participants, we definitely wanted to make sure that we reached out to the JET community, which has been so great and wonderful to both of us. Not just because it launched our careers and gave us so many skills, but we have so many friends around the world who we still are very connected to because of it. And I actually, we lucked out with the JET Southern, like JET SAASC, the acronym with John.
SoCal.
Right, yeah, the SoCal and Arizona one chapter, because they had just done their pre-departure JET meeting. And for those people who don't know, it's that every year when the JET program hires a bunch of gaijin to go and teach in Japan, and of course this year is a little different, there's a pre-departure meeting for all of those people before they leave their native country to go to Japan to kind of onboard them onto what the situation is going to be and what's going to happen. And they bring alumni back to lead panels and workshops about it.
Yeah.
And I just happened to do it this year. And so I knew John, who's the co-president, and I reached out to him and was like, yo, can we do this? And the JET program is just full of really lovely people who was it like sharing cross-cultural awareness, right? And being ambassadors. So there's some work though that we did. Like we probably took about 2 or 3 months to set it up.
You're very professional with your preparations and your Google Docs.
Thank you. Yes. So this is also
content strategist. She's professional.
Yes, like I'm a strategist, so I'm very much on it.
Very
Natalie was
strategic.
very gracious. And I think the biggest thing, like some of the biggest challenges, was just finding a time where we both overlapped because our time zones are so different. But But otherwise, I thought it came together very well. Like Natalie was great. It was easy to, because we're both writers and communicators, it was easy to kind of put things together, and Natalie would go through all the copy and make sure everything was fine, or I would just like send a note and say like, I need something here. And because you have experience with it all, it's like we didn't have to teach each other how to do this. So
yeah.
mm-hmm.
And also I think the fact that it has been this weird year online, that like I've been teaching. I'm a casual university tutor and lecturer, but I've done it all on Zoom this year. So, you know, if you'd have asked me this last year, I think I would have been much more nervous. You know, this is the first time I've done anything that's gone on YouTube, but like doing it, being it, you know, fronting up in front of the screen and everything, that's been good practice in a way for sort of a new type of online presentation skills.
Yeah, and actually, at least the benefit for us is, I think, for people who RSVP'd, is we got a lot of different time zones around the world because we recorded it, and people, you know, were like, well, they'll just show up or they'll listen to it later. So, it was, you know, there are pros aside from the cons, right?
This is the silver lining to this 2020.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, those are all the questions. Before this talk, Natalie was trying to remember if she wanted to remember anything else. And so I will open the floor to her right now.
Open the floor to my fuzzy brain. I guess, I guess the other thing I would like to say is, I think I'd like to just say, like, I agree, we've got a lot of support from the Jet community, who are amazing. And also I'd just like to, probably mention that I've got a lot of support from the Japanese teachers community in Australia. There's like a Facebook group, and they're so active, and they really share resources and tips every day with one another. And I've got a lot of, you know, nice support from those guys following my posts and, you know, buying the book and spreading the word, which has been really great. So I suppose, and also I've been very fortunate, and I would recommend to anyone else self-publishing, definitely it's worth the investment to send some copies to, you know, different people and try to get some reviews happening up front, because that really helps if you've got a few reviews. And I sent the sort of the one that took the most guts, and I really had to sort of, it's taken me time to build up the confidence for these, but I sent a copy to Jim Breen, who's sort of like the maker of the...
I was really impressed by that, because I remember Jim Breen's dictionary in Japan, and that was the one that I looked at. And when I saw that you got that, I was like, wow.
I was impressed too. But he's Australian, so I knew that there was this guy, and he's Australian, and he's like a guru of online Japanese dictionaries, and I knew that. And he used to run the Monash program, which is a big uni in Melbourne. So I just thought, I sent him an email, and, you know, he very graciously replied and kindly wrote me a review. And so did Etsuko Toyoda, who's another academic at Melbourne University. So, you know, don't be too shy to send your copy to VIPs in your industry, because you never know. Like, some of them might just ignore you, but some of them will want to help you out. And it really helped with, I think, just giving it a bit more authority to have those voices.
No, I would agree with that, because I did not do that, mainly for the fact that I think I needed to publish this and get this out for my own like confidence and validation. But definitely in moving forward, like I plan to self-publish in the future, and I agree, I would make more of an effort to kind of mark out and do some pre-copies, or see if I could get some reviews and write to people. And I agree with you. Like, I think overall it's just kind of like, and this is actually, I think, the good thing to end on, of like, this is a huge quality of the JET program, is like, you don't know unless you try, and you don't know unless you communicate the desire. And because I remember so much of my early time also in Japan being like, nobody knew how to interact with me, because they were so nervous about interacting incorrectly with the foreigner. And so you had to be the person to be like, you can interact with me however you want. By the way, like, I eat food, or I, you know, or like, I like talking to people. And if you just kind of make that space, people usually walk through the door, right?
Reach out. I think that's a good, reach out, because you just never know. And there's people who, they just want to help and, you know, help the next generation of people. And that's
Yeah.
going to be us eventually, because, you know, we're going to be other, you know, I'd love to hear from other people doing
Yeah,
their own ideas for Japanese
totally.
books or whatever. And I'll be happy to, you know, review theirs, because you don't lose anything helping other people out.
Hmm. Definitely. Well, thank you, everyone. This is the end of our QA and the end of everything that we had planned for our virtual Very Japanese Reading in English. Stay tuned. Natalie, you can follow obviously on Instagram and Facebook, and there's a web page, and
Yeah, I'm everywhere.
she's
I'm everywhere.
everywhere. And I, and I
That's
am,
good.
yeah, and you can buy her book obviously at all
Yeah.
retailers, as she said
Just
earlier.
Google it. Just
Hmm.
Google it.
Totally there, and you can read reviews about her book because they exist. And people have reviewed my book on Amazon who are not just my mother, so it's great. And they think that it's a good book. And you can find me here on Instagram and Twitter. And stay tuned, because we will continue to produce and dig, and I'm sure
Yeah.
something else is going to happen, right? And
Be back.
we're,
Be
yeah.
back.
Cool.
Pleasure. Always a pleasure, Sarah.
Definitely. Have a good
Yeah,
one.
yeah, you too.
Bye.
Bye.